50 weeks of the year, your world may look something like this. You want to be careful before you visit the national parks. Some of them can be dangerous, because when you get home, you may see your environment differently. Just a little experience with this kind of world makes it harder to tolerate one that looks like this.
You know, creating a national park, it just doesn't happen like magic.
There were repeated calls to bring the islands into a Channel Island park. And there had been bills before when I was very young that had been brought up and failed.
And so I went and I talked to our local congressman, Bob Lager-Mercino, and I said, you know, if you don't introduce a bill to Channel Islands National Park, somebody else is going to do it, and it's in your district, and you know the players. It didn't take much to talk him into it.
And I remember Bill Ehorn was a wonderful guy to work for. He had a vision.
They kind of had the feeling that they knew that this was going to probably happen, but they had concerns about how they would be treated and their way of life.
They all kind of got together and hammered this out that eventually the cattle business would go on for a while.
They did ultimately, as willing sellers, sell to the National Park Service to preserve this great place for future generations.
In 1980, Santa Rosa and 4 other islands were declared a national park. The age of individual ownership and direct decision fades, replaced by well-meaning but complex public management.
When Congress set up the National Park Service 100 years ago, they said your job is to conserve the scenery, the wildlife, the historic objects therein, but for the enjoyment of future generations in an unimpaired condition. That's very important to understand.
On a spring day during the Cousteau expedition, the Park Service takes control of the island.
I think it's a test case. If we cannot manage those islands, I don't see how we're going to manage the world.
I agree.
When the Park Service bought the island in 1987, to tell you the truth, our whole family actually hated the Park Service because they were coming in and taking this place, and we knew it was going to change.
And so we began to allow some visitor use out here.
We had interpretive rangers meeting the visitors at the dock, walking them over to the campground, explaining a little bit about the history, explaining a little bit about the natural history of the island, and then we would set the visitors to areas that would not interfere with the ranching family.
The more people I got to know with the Park Service and understand the mission, the more I realized that was more in line with what I wanted to see done. And then I understood that it was really actually a really good thing for the Park Service to have the island because it was going to protect it and keep it as open space so that people could come out here.
The cattle, of course, when the grass dries up and everything, they're going to get down in these riparian habitats and they cause an impact. And these visitors that came out here and they got back to the mainland, they said, you know, this is a national park and this shouldn't happen. The lawsuit sued the National Park Service for allowing these cattle and grazing activities to continue on the island.
Russ and Al, my father and uncle, and myself, we actually went to Washington, D.C. to fight it, to let this continue as a cattle ranch.
And out of that case hearing was a settlement agreement, which it was agreed upon by Vail and Vickers. We'll remove the cattle and the horses, but we'd like to keep the hunting operation.
And that's when I started work here. And that was a very interesting challenge for me because with the last roundup, it was the end of a way of life.
These are saddles that some of them could be 100 years old.
And in general, I was kind of the man in the middle between park management and the Vails' presence and operation.
It's a real shame that these buildings are all coming apart because nobody lives here anymore.
For me, working out here is it's just wonderful. It's a lift to the spirit and always a lot of fun. I like to share that with the public and talking about the uniqueness of Santa Rosa Island in terms of its natural history and cultural history.
Well, I mean, that's kind of part of the big problem for me is that cultural resources aren't respected. And all the ranching and all the human history that went on here in our generations, it almost feels like they'd wish that would go away.
So when we look at the Vail Ranch on Santa Rosa Island, we see those buildings, They're historic structures. We want to maintain those to tell part of that ranching story, but we could adaptively reuse those buildings to meet either a research purpose or a public purpose of overnight accommodations.
You know, we've got so many resources out here, the plants and the animals, and especially around the beaches. The pinniped populations have exploded around here. I just yesterday saw a banding of a bald eagle. In all my years out here, I'd never seen a bald eagle out here.
They want to preserve the island as it was before, and the ranching history in the last several hundred years, they're not as interested in maintaining, and that's hard to watch.
The ranch was allowed to leave the last of the horses that they didn't think could make the crossing. Everybody had their favorites. There was one that I grew up with, her name was Sadie. The one named Matilda that a lot of the kids learned to ride on. She was really gentle, and she's close to 40 years old. The horses absolutely represent the last vestige of the ranch.
The transition of the islands that were privately owned takes time. The most important piece is, will people enjoy their experience, and will they walk away from Channel Islands saying, I learned something? But more importantly, will they walk away and say, I really am glad that this is a national park.
Well, Tim Vail was the last of the Vails to depart Santa Rosa Island, and it was a very emotional day for all of us. He had a hard time leaving himself, probably more than any of the other family members.
We were sitting on the tailgate, a quarter-mile up the road, and we weren't talking a lot, but just, it was a bit of a teary farewell and a bit of a teary conversation. It was tough.
We all were there to see him off at the airstrip, and there were tears. You know, we really respected the emotions of the moment, because his family, for most of the 20th century, loved this island and took care of it in the best way they could.